In his previous life, Zack made a choice he regretted until his final breath. When the mysterious systems first appeared, he handed the strongest ability to his girlfriend Stella, while keeping the so-called worthless horde system for himself. At the time, everyone believed the storage ability was useless in combat. Stella stayed safely inside the shelter, while Zack risked his life outside every single day. He fought through endless zombie attacks, searched for food and medicine, and cleared escape routes for everyone else to survive. Meanwhile, Stella lived comfortably beside Troy, the man she had secretly cared about all along. And when Zack was finally injured and desperate for help, the shelter doors stayed closed. He was abandoned outside to die, but fate gave him another chance. 7 days before the apocalypse began, Zack opened his eyes once again. Everything around him looked exactly like before. Endless white space stretched in every direction, while glowing streams of light floated through the air like something from a sci-fi world. In front of him hovered 2 giant golden symbols. The first was the Horde system, an unlimited storage dimension where time completely stopped. Anything non-living could be stored instantly and retrieved with a single thought. The second was the Clear system, a terrifying combat ability capable of instantly erasing anything within sight, though every use consumed the user's stamina and life force. Zack remembered this moment perfectly. This was the exact day he and Stella awakened their powers together. Back then, he genuinely cared about her. Since Stella always acted delicate and weak, he thought the storage ability would be too troublesome for her. Managing supplies, traveling constantly, and collecting resources required patience and effort. So he chose the dangerous combat system himself. Each activation felt like needles tearing through his brain, but he endured it anyway. He fought non-stop, while Stella remained protected behind shelter walls, enjoying the rewards he brought back. In the end, his loyalty only got him killed. A familiar voice suddenly reached his ears. Nearby, Stella slowly woke up and immediately looked toward the floating systems. She quickly claimed the red symbol, saying she wanted to protect him this time since he had always been the one protecting her before. She added that the storage ability matched someone careful like him and that he should focus on managing resources instead. Hearing those words almost made Zack laugh. In his previous life, surviving with the Clear system had only been possible because of his combat experience and physical endurance. Stella could barely handle simple tasks normally. If she used that ability even once, she would probably collapse for days. Without hesitation, Zack reached toward the golden infinity symbol. The moment his fingers touched it, warm golden light wrapped around his entire body. Deep inside his consciousness, a massive invisible gate slowly opened. Beyond it was a silent, endless dimension filled with limitless storage space. For the first time since his rebirth, Zack finally felt safe again. System connected, host identified, Zack. Ability acquired, infinite hoarding, current rank, beginner, apocalypse preparation mode activated. The white world slowly disappeared. A second later, Zack opened his eyes inside his apartment, sitting on the leather sofa just like before. Across from him, Stella had also awakened. She excitedly tested her new power, and the crystal ashtray on the table instantly disappeared into thin air. Zack looked at her calmly before speaking a single cold word. "Leave." The smile on Stella's face immediately disappeared. For a moment, Stella looked completely stunned, like she thought Zack was joking. Then she reminded him that the apartment legally belonged to her too, since her name was connected to the place. Zack coldly told her she had 10 minutes to grab her belongings and leave. That instantly made her furious. She started bragging about how she now possessed the strongest awakened ability and warned him that the apocalypse was coming soon. According to her, turning against someone powerful like her would be the biggest mistake of his life. She even threatened that when disaster arrived, he would eventually beg her for help. Zack almost laughed hearing that. From his point of view, her so-called unbeatable ability could currently do nothing more than erase random objects. He reminded her that the Clear system could destroy things, but it could not magically create food, medicine, or resources out of thin air. Stella arrogantly claimed supplies would never be a problem for her. She believed anyone who stood in her way could simply be eliminated. Zack did not bother arguing anymore. He simply wished her luck and pointed toward the exit. A few minutes later, she was gone. The moment the apartment became silent, Zack finally relaxed. In his eyes, Stella had always been dangerous. In his previous life, she had been nothing more than a smiling snake waiting for the perfect moment to betray him. Now that she was finally out of the picture, he could prepare for the apocalypse without holding back. Only 7 days remained before the world collapsed. At the moment, Zack's total assets were nowhere near enough for his real plans. His downtown penthouse alone was worth nearly $8 million, while his family savings and investments added another $3 million. $11 million sounded like a fortune under normal circumstances. But for Zack, it was nothing. He needed enough money to build a fortress capable of surviving temperatures below -70 degrees, resisting endless zombie attacks, and even enduring missile strikes. On top of that, he wanted enough supplies stored away for decades of comfortable survival. Compared to that goal, 11 million barely mattered. Without wasting time, Zach immediately listed the penthouse for sale and began liquidating every asset he owned. He sold company shares, emptied investment accounts, maxed out credit cards, and borrowed money from every online loan service he could find. That still was not enough. So he contacted private lenders as well, the type of people others usually avoided, loan sharks. But Zach did not care about repayment conditions anymore. In less than a week, civilization itself would disappear. No debt collectors would survive long enough to chase him anyway. By the end of the day, the penthouse sold for $6 million. His shares and savings added another $5 million, while online loans brought in $2 million more, $16 million in liquid cash, and the money from the illegal lenders would arrive the next day, adding several million more. Looking at the numbers inside his banking app brought him no happiness at all. To him, money had already lost its meaning. Only supplies mattered now. Without delaying further, Zach left the apartment, got inside the SUV he still owned, and drove toward the western suburbs. His destination was an abandoned cold chain logistics facility that had once been the city's largest refrigerated warehouse center. The location was nearly perfect. The area around it was wide and empty, making enemy approaches easy to notice. The old underground freezing chambers were incredibly solid and naturally insulated. With enough modifications, the place could become the ultimate survival shelter. Weeds covered most of the abandoned property by now, making it look almost forgotten by the world. After searching the site, Zach eventually found the elderly caretaker still living nearby. Without wasting words, he placed several gold coins in front of the old man and casually explained that he wanted to rent the facility for 2 weeks to supposedly build a horror-themed escape room attraction. No paperwork, no questions, just the keys. The old caretaker nearly lost his dentures from smiling so hard. He grabbed the gold immediately, handed over the keys without hesitation, and happily rode away on his old tricycle. Zach slowly walked into the underground storage chamber beneath the abandoned logistics facility. The place was enormous, stretching across nearly 3,000 square meters with ceilings high enough to fit industrial trucks. Even after years of abandonment, the freezing structure remained solid. The moment he stepped inside, he activated the system. A cold, mechanical voice immediately responded. Scanning environment complete. Spatial anchor available. Zach ordered the system to lock onto the location. Once the process finished, the underground chamber officially became a transfer point connected to his storage dimension. From now on, any supply he collected could instantly be moved into this location through thought alone. The base was finally secured. But the next step mattered even more: filling it. Unlike the idiots in cheap apocalypse stories, Zach had no intention of wasting time raiding random supermarkets. Small stores would be emptied within hours once panic began. Wholesale markets were the real target. So instead of heading downtown, he drove directly toward the city's largest agricultural distribution center. The place was packed with warehouses full of rice, flour, oil, vegetables, and bulk food supplies. Zach entered the biggest grain wholesaler in the area, where the owner sat lazily behind the counter with a cigarette hanging from his mouth while checking inventory sheets. The man barely looked up when Zach approached. He casually mentioned that retail buyers belonged at supermarkets nearby. Ignoring the comment, Zach asked for the price of premium rice per ton while scanning the mountains of supply bags stacked around the warehouse. The owner finally became interested and asked how much Zach wanted. Zach simply asked how much stock was available. The owner proudly listed everything in storage: dozens of tons of premium rice, over 100 tons of standard grain, massive amounts of flour, noodles, cooking oil, and mixed cereals. Without hesitation, Zach pulled out a black card and placed it directly on the dirty counter. He told the owner he wanted every single thing in stock. Not only that, he demanded another several hundred tons of fresh rice and flour within 3 days. Only newly harvested goods. Nothing old. The shop owner was stunned. The total value of the order was massive, easily reaching over 10 million. When the owner nervously asked if Zach was serious, Zach gave only one condition. Everything had to be delivered to the abandoned warehouse address he provided. Once unloading was complete, the workers needed to leave immediately without asking questions. That condition sounded strange, but the owner did not care anymore. Business had been terrible recently, and an order this large felt like winning the lottery. Within minutes, the entire wholesale market exploded into action. Forklifts moved non-stop. Workers shouted across loading docks. Trucks were filled one after another. Zach bought everything: rice, flour, cooking oil, dried noodles, fresh fruits, frozen meat, daily necessities. Anything useful for survival disappeared into his growing supply list. By nighttime, the first convoy of heavy trucks arrived at the abandoned refrigeration facility in the western suburbs. Inside the underground chamber, supplies piled up like small mountains. Zach walked toward a giant stack of rice bags nearly 5 meters tall. He calmly pressed one hand against the sacks and activated the system. Instantly, 50 tons of rice vanished without leaving a trace. Closing his eyes, Zack focused his consciousness inside the storage dimension. Within the endless white void of the hoard system, the mountain of rice floated silently in perfect condition. Every bag remained exactly where it had been before disappearing. Not even a single grain had shifted. Inside that space, time itself remained frozen. Food would never rot, medicine would never expire, nothing would decay. The feeling was almost addictive. It felt like controlling an entire world with a single thought. But Zack knew food alone would not guarantee survival. The real enemy of the coming apocalypse was the cold. When temperatures dropped below minus 60 degrees, ordinary shelter would become a frozen tomb. Without a stable heat source, all the food in the world would be useless. People would freeze to death long before starvation became a problem. So Zack immediately made another call, this time to an old contact who specialized in coal transportation. The moment the call connected, Zack got straight to the point. He needed anthracite coal, top quality, 10,000 tons. Zack's preparations did not stop with food and coal. He also ordered massive industrial diesel generators, along with enough solar panels to completely cover the roof of the abandoned facility. His goal was no longer simple survival. He planned to turn the old refrigeration plant into a fully isolated fortress capable of maintaining stable temperatures even during the frozen apocalypse, a place that could survive anything, maybe even a missile strike. Right then, his phone suddenly vibrated. A message from Stella appeared on the screen. Attached was a photo of her sitting beside Troy inside an expensive French restaurant. The table was covered with luxury dishes, wine glasses, and fancy decorations. The message mocked Zack, saying he was probably eating instant noodles alone after getting thrown out while she and Troy celebrated their new beginning together. She even joked that if he begged hard enough, she might spare him a piece of bread someday. Zack only glanced at the message once. Then he calmly blocked her number and shut off the phone completely. To him, Stella was already as good as dead. Back inside the abandoned factory, the construction work continued nonstop. Bright welding sparks flashed across the dark industrial hall while cutting machines screamed loudly through the massive underground structure. Zack stood on an elevated steel walkway overlooking the construction site with a cigarette resting between his fingers. Nearby, his contractor, Hex, stared at the complex blueprint with disbelief written all over his face. The design looked insane. Every wall, floor, and ceiling required thick aerospace-grade aerogel insulation combined with multiple layers of ballistic steel plating. The ventilation system was limited to only 2 heavily protected air intakes, both equipped with military-level NBC filtration systems. To Hex, the place looked less like a shelter and more like a military bunker designed for nuclear war. But Zack simply reminded him that $5 million had already been transferred up front and that the entire project needed to be completed within 3 days. One rule: no questions, no photos, nothing posted online. The massive payment immediately erased most of Hex's doubts. The amount Zack offered was more profit than the man normally earned in years. Excited beyond belief, Hex instantly started shouting orders across the factory floor, telling workers to acquire additional materials from nearby construction sites no matter what it cost. Meanwhile, Zack quietly watched the progress. He understood something most people in the future would learn too late. During the early days of the apocalypse, zombies were not the biggest threat. Humans were. Once food disappeared and temperatures dropped low enough to freeze flesh within minutes, ordinary people would become monsters far worse than the infected. Desperate survivors would tear through weak shelters like starving animals. That was why Zack had also acquired equipment through certain underground connections he preferred not to mention. Soon, several heavy wooden crates were opened inside the factory. Inside them rested military-grade blast-resistant glass alongside high-voltage electric fence generators powerful enough to kill intruders instantly. Normal doors and windows meant nothing against desperate mobs, but thousands of volts of electricity could teach fear very quickly. Zack immediately activated the system again. He ordered all the materials to be stored and automatically positioned according to the fortress blueprint. The workers could handle the basic labor, but the core defense structure was too important to leave in human hands. As soon as the workers left for their meal break, Zack moved silently through the empty factory. With a single thought, enormous blast-proof glass panels vanished one after another into the endless storage dimension. The system continued working with terrifying efficiency. Dozens of tons of construction material disappeared instantly into the storage space before reappearing exactly where Zack wanted them. Huge reinforced glass panels slid perfectly into the factory skylights without a single mistake. No cranes, no delays, no human worker could ever match that level of accuracy. With the main structure nearly complete, Zack finally shifted his attention toward the inside of the shelter. Surviving the apocalypse was important, but he had no intention of suffering through it like a homeless scavenger. If he was going to live through the end of the world, he planned to live comfortably. So he drove straight to the city's biggest luxury furniture exhibition center. The moment he entered, he started buying almost everything that caught his eye. smart home systems, luxury sofas, high-end mattresses, imported carpets, automatic kitchen equipment, entertainment systems, premium lighting, and custom furniture. The saleswoman following him around could barely hide her excitement. Her smile stayed frozen on her face while she rushed to keep up with his endless orders, scribbling prices and product codes non-stop like she had just encountered the richest customer of her life. But Zach was far from finished. After clearing out half the furniture center, he headed toward a professional outdoor survival store. This was where the truly important purchases began. He ordered dozens of extreme cold survival suits designed for temperatures below -80 degrees, tactical snow boots, thermal gloves, ski goggles, climbing axes, military-grade multi-tools, folding shovels, portable heating devices, and huge amounts of self-heating combat rations. Anything useful for surviving the frozen apocalypse disappeared into his shopping list. While moving through the store, Zach suddenly heard a familiar voice nearby. A woman was happily asking her boyfriend how she looked in an expensive pink winter jacket. The voice instantly made him stop. Turning slightly, he saw Stella standing near the VIP lounge while Troy lazily sat nearby scrolling through his phone. Stella complained about the price tag on the coat, but Troy quickly reminded her they needed to save money because Damien had sold the apartment without leaving them anything. According to him, they needed to think carefully about the future. Hearing that almost amused Zach. He did not even bother speaking to them. In just a few days, luxury clothes and expensive restaurants would become meaningless. Once the world froze over, those two would probably end up fighting stray animals for scraps. Compared to what was coming, they were already doomed. Back at the underground facility, the transformation was happening rapidly. The abandoned refrigeration plant no longer looked like a ruined warehouse. It now resembled a heavily fortified military bunker. Every wall had been wrapped in thick insulation materials. Layers of silver thermal protection covered the structure under the industrial lights. All ordinary windows had been sealed completely, leaving only narrow reinforced observation openings behind ballistic protection. At the main entrance, 3 giant blast doors now stood in sequence. Each one weighed several tons. Breaking through them would be nearly impossible. During the final stage of construction, Hex secretly approached Zach while carrying a long wooden box. With a proud expression, he explained that obtaining the item had not been easy. It originally came from an old emergency response department and had later been modified by specialists. When Zach opened the case, a black tactical breaching axe rested inside. The weapon looked both brutal and beautiful. Its sharpened blade reflected cold light, while the handle had been wrapped carefully for grip and durability. One swing from something like this could split through reinforced doors or crush bone easily. Zach nodded in satisfaction. This was exactly the kind of weapon he needed for the early days of the apocalypse. Finally, as the last construction vehicle departed, the enormous steel entrance slowly sealed shut behind it. Standing alone at the center of the completed fortress, Zach quietly looked over the endless mountains of supplies surrounding him. For the first time since his rebirth, he truly felt prepared for what was coming next. On one side of the underground fortress sat the food reserves. Massive mountains of rice, flour, cooking oil, dried goods, and preserved supplies filled the storage area almost beyond sight. The amount was enough for a single person to survive comfortably for generations. Another section was dedicated entirely to energy. Rows of diesel barrels lined the walls beside huge piles of high-grade coal. Nearby, stacks of solar battery systems and industrial generators waited to power the fortress once the outside world collapsed into ice and darkness. At the center of the shelter was the living space. Luxury furniture still wrapped in protective packaging, expensive appliances, gaming collections, books, entertainment systems, and every comfort Zach could think of had already been moved inside. But even after all that, his storage dimension still felt far too empty. That meant only one thing. The easy part was over. If money could no longer solve the problem, he would simply take what he needed himself. Dressed in a black tactical outfit, Zach equipped night vision goggles and attached the breaching axe to his waist before leaving the shelter under the cover of darkness. Tonight's target was the East Harbor Bonded Logistics Center, the largest import-export storage port in the entire city. Countless shipping containers filled the docks like giant steel towers, carrying expensive products from all over the world. Imported beef, luxury alcohol, rare ingredients, electronics, medicine, vehicles, and countless other goods sat waiting for delivery. Hidden in the shadows between stacked containers, Zach quietly activated the system. A powerful, invisible scan instantly spread outward across the surrounding area. Within moments, detailed information flooded his mind. Every container nearby appeared like glowing markers inside his consciousness, each labeled with its contents. The moment Zach located the medical supplies, his expression changed. In the frozen apocalypse, medicine would become more valuable than gold itself. Without hesitation, he activated the storage ability. An entire shipping container filled with antibiotics and medical equipment disappeared instantly from the harbor without making a sound. The rotating security cameras continued moving normally. The guards nearby remained half asleep. Nobody noticed anything. Millions worth of supplies vanished in complete silence. Zack continued moving through the endless maze of containers like a phantom. One after another, entire shipments disappeared into his subspace storage. Luxury food, fuel, electronics, cold weather gear, nothing useful was left behind. At one point, Zack suddenly discovered something that genuinely surprised him. A shipment of heavy-duty snowmobiles prepared for extreme environments. There were 20 of them. Perfect transportation for the coming frozen wasteland. Without hesitation, Zack stored every single one. Just as he prepared to leave, the sound of roaring engines suddenly shattered the quiet harbor. Several heavily modified black SUVs rushed into the port at high speed before stopping near a hidden warehouse area. A group of rough-looking men quickly stepped out. Most carried metal clubs while a few held homemade firearms. Tattoos covered their arms and necks, making it obvious they were not ordinary workers. Leading them was a massive bald man who aggressively shouted orders while the group unloaded cargo crates from the vehicles. Something about the scene immediately caught Zack's attention. The crates were marked with dangerous materials warnings. Activating the system scan again, Zack checked the contents instantly. Explosives, industrial detonators, large amounts of ammonium nitrate. This was not normal smuggling. The group belonged to the Black Shark Gang, the largest criminal organization in the city. In Zack's previous life, the Black Shark Gang became one of the strongest forces during the early days of the apocalypse. Using weapons and violence, they occupied the city's central stadium and turned it into the infamous Black Shark Camp. Back then, Zack would have escaped the moment he saw them. But things were different now. To him, this was not danger. It was an opportunity. Since the gang had conveniently gathered explosives and weapons in one place, Zack decided he might as well take everything for himself. Using the system's detection ability, he quietly moved around to the rear side of the warehouse while staying completely hidden in the darkness. From there, the entire building sat perfectly within his storage range. Without hesitation, Zack activated the system. He locked onto every explosive detonator and dangerous material inside the warehouse. Then he issued a single command: store everything. Inside the warehouse, the gang members suddenly froze in confusion. The heavy crates they were carrying vanished instantly from their hands. Then more boxes disappeared, and more. Stacks of explosives sitting on the floor evaporated without warning. Metal cases filled with detonators vanished next. Within seconds, the entire warehouse was completely empty. Silence filled the building. The gangsters stood there holding nothing but air, staring at each other with blank expressions as their brains struggled to understand what had just happened. Finally, the bald leader exploded in rage. He screamed that someone had stolen everything and wildly pointed his handgun toward the darkness while demanding the thief show himself. But by then, Zack was already long gone. Later that same day, the city's weather department released a blue-level cold wave warning. The forecast predicted temperatures would drop by around 15 degrees overnight. Nobody cared. Most people treated it like an ordinary winter storm and simply planned to wear thicker jackets. Meanwhile, Zack remained inside his completed fortress. He had no reason to leave anymore. Every window and secondary entrance had already been permanently sealed shut with reinforced steel. Only the main blast door remained accessible. The diesel generators had been fully prepared and tested. Coal reserves were stacked beside the massive indoor heating system, ready for immediate use. For the first time since his rebirth, Zack finally allowed himself to relax. Inside the warm living area, he prepared a luxurious hot pot dinner using premium Wagyu beef he had taken from the harbor earlier. Fresh vegetables were cleaned carefully, while an expensive bottle of imported wine sat open beside the table. Outside, the world still looked peaceful. Inside, Zack quietly waited for civilization to collapse. Before eating, he checked social media one final time. As expected, Stella had posted recently. The photo showed her standing on an outdoor balcony, wearing a thin evening dress while the bright city skyline glittered behind her. Her caption talked about how winter might be arriving, but her heart still felt warm. She thanked someone for a surprise gift and mocked people who relied only on money while pretending the future looked bright. Zack smiled slightly after reading it. Then he left a single comment beneath the post. He told her to enjoy the cold wind while she still could because it would probably be the last normal breeze she ever felt. After that, he removed the SIM card from his phone and casually tossed it into the burning fireplace. No more distractions, no more contact with the outside world. A few moments later, the light rain outside suddenly stopped. Then came a heavy impact against the reinforced glass. A large hailstone had slammed into the fortress, another followed, then hundreds more. The sky erupted violently as massive hailstones crashed down non-stop, while powerful freezing winds screamed across the city. Almost immediately, temperatures began falling at terrifying speed. An emergency alert suddenly appeared across every remaining device screen. A global polar vortex disaster was underway. Within hours, temperatures worldwide were expected to drop by over 50 degrees. Citizens were ordered to return home immediately. This was not a test. The apocalypse had officially begun. Outside, the world transformed in less than an hour. The snowfall was nothing like the calm winter scenes people imagined. Violent winds tore through the city, while razor-sharp ice crystals blasted across the streets, hard enough to cut exposed skin. Inside the underground fortress, Zack sat comfortably in the monitoring room, watching everything through rows of surveillance screens. The factory's remote location gave him a perfect view of the collapsing city. Through the high-resolution cameras pointed toward the distant highway, he watched disaster unfold in real time. Roads froze solid within minutes as layers of black ice spread everywhere. Cars lost control one after another, crashing into guardrails and piling together in massive wrecks. The outside temperature had already fallen below -30 degrees, and it was still dropping rapidly. Meanwhile, far away in a luxury downtown apartment, Stella was curled up tightly inside an expensive cashmere blanket, while shivering uncontrollably. The glamorous life she had proudly shown off online only hours earlier was already falling apart. Her face had turned pale, and even her lips were beginning to lose color from the cold. The entire apartment building had lost heating after frozen pipes burst throughout the system. Indoor temperatures continued falling dangerously fast. Panicking, Stella demanded Troy do something before they both froze to death. Troy snapped back irritably, reminding her he was freezing too. Neither of them could understand how the weather had turned catastrophic so suddenly. They desperately searched through drawers and bags looking for anything useful. After several minutes, they managed to find only a few remaining hand warmers, nowhere near enough to survive the night. Then Troy suddenly remembered something. Damien. According to him, Damien still had money and probably prepared supplies or rented somewhere safe. He insisted Stella contact him immediately. Clinging to that idea like a lifeline, Stella quickly grabbed her phone and tried calling, but the call never connected. The phone number had already been shut down. Furious, Stella threw the phone onto the couch and cursed him for disappearing at a time like this. A moment later, she suddenly remembered something Zack had mentioned before: the western suburbs, a factory. She became convinced he was hiding there. At that point, the two of them realized they had no other option. Staying in the apartment meant freezing to death sooner or later. So they layered themselves with every piece of clothing they owned before rushing downstairs and forcing their way into the car through the raging blizzard. As Troy struggled to drive toward the western outskirts of the city, Stella angrily swore she would force Damien to kneel and apologize once they found him. Back inside the fortress, Zack calmly watched everything through his surveillance system. One camera caught a disturbing scene outside. Several stray dogs had gathered together near an abandoned alley while trembling violently in the snow. Then their eyes slowly turned blood red. Their bodies twitched unnaturally as sharp fangs began extending from their mouths. Zack quietly observed the transformation without surprise. This was not a normal disaster. The frozen storm carried a terrifying infection known as the permafrost virus. Soon, both humans and animals would begin mutating into monsters. Checking the time, Zack estimated Stella and Troy would need roughly 2 hours to reach the factory. That was assuming they survived the blizzard, or the infected creatures now roaming outside. Honestly, Zack hoped they would make it. After all, revenge was far more satisfying when the victims arrived personally. He calmly stood up and walked toward the central control console. Then he pressed a large red button. Combat Defense Mode, Level 1, activated. Instantly, the outer electric fence surrounding the facility surged to life. Bright blue arcs of electricity snapped violently through the snowstorm, forming a deadly web around the fortress perimeter. Anything touching it would die instantly. Standing safely behind layers of reinforced steel and bulletproof glass, Zack slowly raised his wine glass toward the screens, showing the collapsing world outside. Then he silently toasted the coming storm. The apocalypse had fully arrived. The blizzard outside had become completely uncontrollable. Snow and ice swallowed the streets, while visibility dropped so low that seeing even a few meters ahead became almost impossible. The freezing wind howled non-stop like countless blades scraping across metal. Through the storm, a white BMW struggled forward slowly across the buried highway. Inside the vehicle, Stella was panicking. She kept asking why they still had not reached the factory, even though Troy claimed it should have been nearby already. Troy, whose hands were already turning numb from the cold, snapped back angrily while gripping the steering wheel. The navigation system showed they were close, but the snowstorm had buried the road completely. Then, disaster struck. A loud crack echoed beneath the vehicle. The SUV suddenly jerked violently before dropping to one side. Moments later, the engine died completely. The undercarriage had slammed against hardened ice hidden beneath the snow, and the freezing temperatures caused part of the drive system to break instantly. The car was finished. Troy slammed his frozen fist against the steering wheel in frustration, only to hiss in pain as his skin nearly stuck to the icy surface. Stella completely lost control at that point. She screamed that he was useless and accused him of getting them killed before pointing toward a dark silhouette barely visible through the blizzard. Ahead of them stood the outline of the factory, Believing it was their only chance to survive, the two abandoned the dead vehicle and forced themselves through the storm on foot. By the time they finally reached the entrance, both of them were nearly crawling through the snow. But when they looked up properly, shock instantly hit them. The place no longer resembled an abandoned factory at all. It looked like a heavily armored fortress. Massive reinforced walls towered above them, while the giant steel entrance looked impossible to breach. Desperate, Stella rushed forward and started pounding both fists against the freezing metal door while screaming Damien's name. Inside the fortress, Zack comfortably leaned back on his leather sofa while calmly watching the surveillance feeds covering the entrance. On the monitor, two faint red heat signatures clung to the outer gate like insects trapped in a snowstorm. Meanwhile, the warm room smelled of rich, spicy broth from the hot pot simmering beside him. Fresh slices of tripe floated through the bubbling soup while steam filled the air. Completely relaxed, Zack picked up his wine glass before activating the fortress speaker system. His voice calmly echoed outside through the blizzard. He casually asked who was banging on doors in the middle of the night and complained about disturbing the peace. Hearing his voice instantly gave Stella hope. She desperately shouted that it was her and begged him to open the door before they froze to death outside. Zack calmly picked up another piece of food before pretending not to recognize her voice. That nearly drove Stella insane. She was freezing to death outside while he was comfortably eating hot pot inside a heated fortress. Trying to soften her tone, Stella claimed everything that happened before had been a misunderstanding and begged for another chance. But Zack only laughed quietly. Through the speaker, he calmly asked which part had supposedly been a misunderstanding. The slap? Throwing him out? Or abandoning him to die outside like a stray dog in his previous life? Stella immediately became defensive. She claimed she only said those things in anger and insisted he was acting petty for refusing to forgive her even after she apologized. But Zack's response was cold. According to him, if apologies alone solved everything, laws would not even need to exist. Then he reminded her of something else. She now possessed the powerful clear system. If the giant steel door was really bothering her so much, she could simply destroy it herself. Hearing that, Stella gritted her teeth and finally prepared to use her ability. Stella's expression turned completely cold after hearing Zack refuse to open the gate. She shouted that if he would not let her inside willingly, she would force the door open herself. She even warned him not to regret humiliating her later. Despite her body already shaking violently from the freezing temperature, Stella forced herself to raise a trembling hand toward the massive steel entrance. Then she activated the clear system. A violent burst of red energy exploded from her palm and slammed directly into the reinforced door. But nothing happened. The steel barrier remained completely untouched. Instead, the energy wave crashed against some invisible resistance surrounding the fortress and rebounded backward violently. The impact instantly numbed Stella's arm and threw her backward into the snow. At the same moment, the system inside her mind issued a warning. The target exceeded the destruction limit. External reinforcement energy was interfering with her ability. Attempting forced destruction would consume an enormous amount of life force. Then Zack's laughter echoed through the speaker system, calm, mocking, merciless. He casually explained that the door had been built using aerospace-grade alloy worth millions. More importantly, his hoard system naturally reinforced structures connected to his storage space. That meant Stella's clear system could not erase anything protected by his ability. Realizing her power was useless against the fortress completely shattered the confidence she had relied on. The speaker suddenly went silent. Then powerful floodlights mounted above the entrance turned on instantly. Blinding white beams crashed down onto Stella and Troy, forcing both of them to shield their eyes from the intense light. Stella collapsed into the snow in disbelief. For the first time in her life, true hopelessness began sinking into her heart. Another 30 minutes passed. Neither she nor Troy left the fortress entrance, not because they wanted to stay, because they had nowhere else to go. Their vehicle was destroyed, and walking back through the storm would only end in death. Then suddenly, a low mechanical sound echoed overhead. Both of them looked up weakly. Several meters above the gate, a ventilation opening slowly slid open. A wave of rich, mouth-watering aroma drifted out into the freezing air. Hot pot broth, boiling beef fat, tender lamb simmering with spices and fresh vegetables. The scent felt almost unreal in the middle of the frozen apocalypse. For starving people trapped in a deadly blizzard, it was pure torture. Stella swallowed hard, despite her dry throat. Beside her, Troy's stomach growled loudly. Then Zack's voice returned once more, smooth, relaxed, cruel. Standing on the second-floor terrace above the gate, he calmly looked down at them while holding a steaming bowl of hot pot in his hand. To him, the two people below no longer looked human. They looked like starving stray animals begging outside a restaurant. Troy finally broke first. Pride no longer mattered when death was standing directly behind him. He dropped to his knees in the snow and desperately begged Zack for even a single bite of food or a sip of warm soup. Zack only smiled faintly, then he casually picked up a slice of freshly cooked beef with his chopsticks. For a moment, Stella and Troy stared at it with desperate eyes. Then Zach deliberately released it. The meat dropped straight into the filthy snow below with a wet sound before becoming soaked in icy slush. The instant it landed, Troy lunged toward it without thinking. But Stella moved even faster. The sight below almost looked ridiculous. Stella, who once refused to drink anything except imported mineral water, now fought over a dirty piece of meat like a starving animal. The beef Zach had thrown into the snow was covered in slush and ice, but Stella grabbed it instantly and shoved it into her mouth without hesitation. The heat burned her tongue badly, yet she still swallowed it whole without even chewing properly. Tears streamed down her frozen face while she desperately nodded upward, claiming it tasted good. Watching her from above, Zach smiled faintly. Then he calmly grabbed a container filled with leftover scraps from the hot pot. Bones, chili oil, peppercorns, vegetable remains, and greasy broth were all dumped directly from the terrace above. The boiling liquid splashed into the small, sheltered area where Stella and Troy had been hiding from the wind, but the moment the soup touched the freezing ground, it instantly hardened into thick ice. Now even the small, dry space they had been standing on became dangerously slippery. Without the slightest hint of sincerity, Zach casually told them that since they had eaten already, they should probably start running. According to the fortress sensors, some unexpected visitors were approaching, and apparently the smell of food had attracted them. The moment those words sank in, movement appeared deep within the blizzard ahead. Pairs of glowing green eyes slowly emerged through the storm, one after another. Low growls drifted across the frozen wind. The infected dogs had arrived. Troy reacted immediately. Without even thinking, he grabbed Stella's arm and tried dragging her away from the fortress entrance. But the ground beneath them had become solid ice. Both of them instantly lost balance and crashed face first into the snow. That single mistake almost killed them. The first infected beast reached them immediately. It was a mutated Tibetan Mastiff nearly the size of a small bull. Its body was covered in frozen, rotten flesh, while its massive jaws snapped open, wide enough to crush bone. The creature lunged directly at Troy and bit deep into his thigh. His scream tore through the blizzard. Then, in that desperate instant between life and death, Troy made his choice. Without hesitation, he grabbed Stella and shoved her directly toward the monster to save himself. The betrayal happened so naturally, it almost looked instinctive. Stella screamed in horror as the gigantic infected dog turned toward her throat. At that exact moment, survival instinct completely overwhelmed everything else inside her mind. Fear, pain, love, trust. None of it mattered anymore. Only survival remained. As the monstrous jaws rushed toward her face, the red system symbol inside Stella's mind flashed violently. She activated the clear system with everything she had. This time, her target was not an indestructible steel fortress. It was flesh. The moment the ability triggered, the mutated mastiff's skull disappeared instantly. 1 second, the creature existed. The next, half its head was simply gone. The remaining body still slammed into Stella from sheer momentum, nearly crushing her beneath its enormous weight. But she survived. And in that moment, Stella finally understood something important. Her ability was terrifying against living creatures. From the upper level of the fortress, Zach calmly lowered the binoculars in his hand. A faint smile appeared in his eyes. He had expected this outcome from the beginning. After all, Stella possessed an S-rank combat system. If she died that easily, the real entertainment would end far too soon. Zach eventually decided there was no point waiting for Stella and Troy to leave on their own. So the fortress speaker activated once more. This time, he calmly informed them that about 200 meters east of the facility stood an old security booth once used by factory guards. The place was damaged and half broken, but at least it still had a roof. According to Zach, it was probably their only chance of surviving the night. The moment he finished speaking, the terrace window closed completely. The lights surrounding the fortress shut off one after another. Darkness swallowed everything. Outside, Stella and Troy stood trembling in the snow, while more glowing green eyes slowly appeared through the blizzard around them. The infected pack was getting closer. Without wasting another second, Stella shoved the dead dog body off herself and forced her frozen body upright. She never even glanced toward Troy. The moment he used her as bait earlier, whatever trust remained between them had died completely. As the mutated creatures began circling closer, the two desperately stumbled through the storm toward the ruined security booth Zach mentioned. The structure barely qualified as shelter. Most of the windows were shattered. Freezing wind slipped through every crack, and the damaged door could not even close properly. Still, compared to standing outside in the open snowfield, it felt almost luxurious. Using broken wood pieces and old newspapers, they blocked as much of the wind as possible before collapsing onto the dirty floor in exhaustion. After catching his breath, Troy cautiously tried speaking to Stella again. He reached toward her hand and awkwardly claimed that earlier he had only been trying to push the infected dog away, not sacrifice her. But Stella instantly pulled away. The expression on her face had become terrifyingly cold. The innocent and delicate personality she normally pretended to have was completely gone now. Survival had stripped away the act and revealed what she truly was underneath. Selfish, calculating, ruthless. She openly told Troy that she understood exactly what kind of person he was. According to her, the only reason she kept him around before was because he looked good and knew how to talk. But now, he was nearly useless. Then she gave him a direct warning. If he ever tried sacrificing her again, or laid another hand on her, she would erase his head the same way she erased the infected dog earlier. Hearing that instantly made Troy go silent. For a brief moment, hatred flashed deep inside his eyes, but he quickly buried it. He understood the situation clearly now. Stella controlled the clear system, and even though her power could not create food or shelter, killing him would be effortless. So for now, he had no choice but to endure quietly. Before long, hunger returned once again. That tiny piece of meat from earlier had done almost nothing. The freezing cold continuously drained energy from their bodies at an alarming speed. Trying to make himself useful again, Troy began searching through the old security booth for anything edible. Most of the place was nothing but garbage and dust. But just as he was about to give up, his fingers touched something hard beneath an old bed frame. He quickly pulled it out. A frozen sausage link. Part of it had already been gnawed through by rats long ago, and the entire thing was frozen solid like a piece of red stone. But to Troy, it looked more valuable than gold. Instinctively, he tried hiding it inside his jacket before Stella noticed. Unfortunately for him, she already had. Her cold voice immediately ordered him to hand it over. Troy froze on the spot. Then he slowly turned around with an awkward, forced smile while pretending everything was fine. Trying to sound generous, he suggested they split it evenly. Stella extended her hand toward Troy without the slightest warmth in her eyes. A faint red glow flickered in her palm as the clear system activated quietly. The threat did not need words. Troy clenched his jaw but still handed over the frozen sausage without resistance. The moment Stella grabbed it, any idea of sharing immediately disappeared from her mind. She ripped the packaging open and bit directly into the frozen meat without caring about dirt, germs, or blood. The sausage was so hard from the cold that it sliced her gums open, but the taste of grease and starch still made her feel almost emotional with relief. In only a few bites, she devoured nearly all of it. Only a tiny leftover piece remained. Seeing Troy stare at the food with desperate, starving eyes, Stella let out a mocking laugh before tossing the final piece toward him like scraps thrown to a stray dog. Then she coldly declared that from now on, anything he found belonged to her first. If she left anything behind afterward, only then would he be allowed to eat. Troy silently picked the dirty frozen piece off the ground and shoved it into his mouth along with the plastic wrapper. He lowered his head while chewing quietly, but hidden deep inside his eyes was pure hatred. At that moment, he swore to himself that if he ever gained power of his own or survived long enough for the storm to end, Stella would eventually pay for humiliating him like this. Meanwhile, inside the fortress, several hundred meters away, Zack was enjoying a completely different world. Deep underground, he relaxed comfortably inside a heated whirlpool bath while browsing information on a tablet. Most of the public internet had already collapsed worldwide, but his private satellite communication system still functioned perfectly. Across the screen, emergency headlines from around the world continued appearing non-stop. New York had declared a full state of emergency after large sections of Manhattan froze solid. Tokyo had fallen into riots while military communication systems reportedly disappeared. Countless governments were losing control. Then, a domestic emergency broadcast appeared. The nation had officially activated its highest emergency disaster response. Government shelters across every major city were now open to the public. One specific location immediately caught Zack's attention: the city sports center. In his previous life, that place became the largest official survivor camp during the early phase of the apocalypse. But because too many desperate civilians flooded into the shelter at once, supplies vanished rapidly. Corruption, panic, and poor management eventually pushed the entire place into chaos. Within a month, massive food riots broke out inside the camp. Tens of thousands died, and during that period, Stella became nothing more than a forced labor tool for the authorities. Since her ability could clear obstacles, she was constantly ordered to remove frozen roads and collapse structures in exchange for tiny food portions barely enough to survive. Remembering that future made Zack realize something important. History was still moving almost exactly the same way. After turning off the newsfeed, Zack opened his system interface. Current stored supplies exceeded 30,000 tons, but his system level remained low. To upgrade further, the Horde system required a special resource: zombie crystal cores, specifically 10 level 1 cores. Zack slowly stepped out of the bath while thinking carefully. In his previous life, humanity only discovered months later that zombies and mutated creatures occasionally formed crystal cores inside their skulls. Those crystals could strengthen awakened abilities dramatically. Right now, most infected creatures had not evolved far enough yet, but mutated animals were different. Creatures like the infected dogs outside already had a decent chance of developing early-stage cores. Thinking back to the battle earlier, Zack almost laughed. Stella had been so desperate to survive that she completely ignored the most valuable thing left behind in the snow. The mutated dog corpse outside the shelter was no longer just a dead monster. To Zack, it was experience points waiting to be collected. Zack had no intention of leaving valuable resources buried outside in the snow. After drying off, he equipped himself with one of the specialized combat suits he had spent a fortune acquiring before the apocalypse began. The lightweight suit looked thin, but hidden inside the material were advanced heating fibers connected to a compact energy cell attached at his waist. Even in temperatures cold enough to freeze exposed flesh within seconds, the suit kept his body warm and stable. He secured the tactical axe at his side, activated the helmet systems, and stepped outside the fortress. Tonight's goal was simple: collect his first crystal cores, and maybe check whether Stella and Troy were still alive inside the ruined security booth. By around 3 in the morning, the blizzard had weakened slightly, but the temperature remained horrifying. -50 degrees. At that level of cold, even metal became dangerously brittle. Ordinary people would freeze solid in minutes. Yet across the frozen wasteland near the western outskirts, a dark figure moved steadily through the snow. Through Zack's helmet visor, thermal imaging highlighted the surrounding environment in glowing colors, while the filtration system protected him from the airborne permafrost virus. Ahead of him, the infected dog pack still surrounded the security booth. Apparently, the creatures had not abandoned their prey yet. The mutated beasts paced slowly around the structure, while occasionally scraping their claws across the metal walls, producing harsh, screeching noises through the frozen air. 7 infected dogs remained. Using the visor display, Zack calmly marked every target one by one. The creatures were dangerous, but the extreme cold had also slowed them down significantly. Their joints had stiffened in the freezing environment, reducing their movement speed. For Zack, this was the perfect opportunity. The instant he decided to move, his body exploded forward through the snow like a black shadow. The first infected dog never even realized he was there. While the creature continued growling toward the security booth, Zack's tactical axe sliced cleanly through its neck in a single motion. The system immediately rewarded him with experience points. The kill alert instantly triggered the rest of the pack. The largest infected mastiff turned toward Zack immediately, its glowing green eyes filled with aggression. With a violent roar, the giant creature launched itself forward like a charging tank. Its enormous jaws opened wide as it lunged directly toward Zack's throat. But Zack remained completely calm. At the exact moment the beast entered striking range, he activated the horde system. The frozen ground beneath the mastiff suddenly disappeared. Not just the surface ice. The earth below vanished too. A deep pit instantly opened beneath the charging creature. Unable to stop its own momentum, the giant infected dog crashed directly into the hole with a sickening impact. The sound of breaking bones echoed upward immediately. Without hesitation, Zack jumped down after it. Before the injured monster could even recover, the tactical axe flashed through the darkness in a perfect arc. A second later, the mastiff's head rolled across the frozen ground. System notification appeared again. Elite infected creature eliminated. Large experience reward acquired. The system notification appeared almost immediately after the elite infected dog died. A level 1 power crystal core had dropped. Seeing that message instantly lifted Zack's mood. Without wasting time, he crouched beside the shattered remains of the infected mastiff and pushed aside his disgust while searching through the broken skull with gloved hands. A few moments later, he pulled out a tiny crystal glowing faintly red beneath the snow. The object was barely larger than a fingernail, but in the apocalypse, this tiny thing was worth more than gold. Crystal cores were the source of mutated power and the foundation for strengthening awakened abilities. In Zack's previous life, a single low-level core could easily be traded for enough food to feed ordinary survivors for weeks. Meanwhile, the remaining infected dogs circled the pit above while barking aggressively, unable to reach him. Zack simply looked upward with a cold smile. To him, they were no longer monsters, just walking experience points. With a single thought, he pulled another weapon from the storage dimension, a heavily modified industrial nail gun connected to a compressed gas cylinder. The next few minutes became a complete massacre. One by one, the infected dogs were eliminated before they could even properly react. After the fight ended, Zack calmly searched every corpse. By the end of the hunt, he collected 3 crystal cores in total, not bad for the first night. After finishing, Zack walked toward the nearby security booth to check on Stella and Troy, but the place was already empty. The broken shelter contained only scattered footprints leading away into the frozen darkness. On one wall, someone had scratched a crude message using their fingernails, a threat aimed directly at him. Zack only laughed dismissively after reading it. People like Stella and Troy always believed survival itself meant victory. But Zack knew better. Sometimes living through the apocalypse was far crueler than dying quickly, especially for selfish people too weak to protect themselves. Leaving the empty booth behind, Zack disappeared once again into the storm. His next target was the First People's Hospital near the city center. This trip was not only about hunting infected creatures, there was something extremely important stored there: antiviral serum. While Stella and Troy fought over scraps of rotten food, Zack sped across the frozen city on one of the imported snowmobiles he stole earlier from the harbor. The once crowded streets now looked like a dead white wasteland, buried beneath layers of snow and ice. Entire vehicles remained frozen beneath the surface, like insects trapped inside ancient amber. The hospital eventually appeared through the storm. Most of the building's windows had already shattered from the cold, and the plaza outside was packed with frozen, infected people. Some remained locked in place, like statues, while still standing in registration lines. Others looked as though they had frozen while trying to escape. But Zack knew appearances meant nothing. The infected were not truly dead. The moment they sensed warmth or movement, they would wake instantly. Activating another system function, Zack created a silent field around himself. The ability dampened sound completely within a short radius, allowing him to move without attracting attention. Using a grappling hook, he avoided the dangerous main lobby entirely and climbed directly toward a third-floor pharmacy window. Inside the building, the number of infected creatures was much smaller. Only a few mutated nurses wandered aimlessly through the dark hallway. Zack quietly drew the tactical axe once more. Then he moved. 2 swift strikes, 2 clean kills. Not a single sound echoed through the hospital corridor. Zack moved through the hospital pharmacy without hesitation. The moment he reached the shelves, he activated the horde system and swept his hand across the room. Entire rows of medicine disappeared instantly. Antibiotics, painkillers, anti-inflammatory drugs, insulin, blood pressure medicine, cold medicine, emergency supplies. He did not waste time sorting anything carefully. In the apocalypse, every type of medicine had value sooner or later. Right as Zack continued emptying the pharmacy, loud gunfire suddenly exploded from somewhere below the building. The noise shattered the silence of the frozen night. Immediately, Zack frowned and moved toward the shattered window to check outside. Down in the hospital plaza, 2 heavily modified armored vehicles smashed through the entrance gates at high speed. A group of armed men quickly jumped out while firing rifles and shotguns wildly at the infected gathering nearby. The moment Zack noticed the Black Shark emblem painted on the vehicles, he instantly recognized them: the Black Shark Gang. Apparently, they had already realized how valuable medical supplies would become and decided to raid the hospital under cover of darkness. Zack did not interfere. Instead, he calmly leaned against the window and watched the situation unfold from above like it was entertainment. The gang possessed serious firepower. Because the freezing weather had slowed most infected creatures, the armed group managed to clear a path quickly and force their way into the hospital lobby. According to the scarred gang leader barking orders, their goal was simple: take the blood plasma reserves and all important medicine. Ignore everything else. At first, the operation seemed successful, but they had made one massive mistake: noise. The non-stop gunfire echoed across the surrounding blocks and deep throughout the hospital structure itself. That sound woke up everything nearby. Not only the infected outside, something much worse hidden beneath the building also awakened. Suddenly, the hospital floor exploded upward with a deafening crash. Concrete and metal flew everywhere as a gigantic figure burst out from the underground parking area. The creature stood over 3 meters tall. Unlike ordinary frozen zombies, this thing looked horrifyingly muscular and swollen with unnatural strength. Its skin resembled dark gray metal while massive veins twisted across its body like cables. This was not a normal infected. It was a level 2 mutant, a tyrant-type strength evolution. The moment Zack saw it clearly, even his eyes sharpened slightly. A level 2 mutant appearing this early was unusual, but hospitals were filled with death and infection. Places like this often produced stronger monsters faster than anywhere else. Down below, the Black Shark Gang completely panicked. Several rifles instantly opened fire at the mutant, but the bullets barely penetrated its thick muscle tissue. Most rounds only drew shallow wounds. The tyrant barely reacted. Then, with terrifying force, the monster ripped an entire hospital bed from the ground and hurled it like a giant weapon. 2 gang members were crushed instantly before they could even scream properly. The entire situation collapsed into chaos. Only moments earlier, the gangsters had looked fearless while waving guns around. Now they were desperately trying to escape. Watching the scene from above, Zack's eyes lit up slightly. He did not care whether the Black Shark Gang survived or died. What interested him was the tyrant's crystal core. A level 2 core this early in the apocalypse was an incredible treasure. If he obtained it, there was a high chance his system would level up immediately and unlock new abilities. And there was another reward too. Those armored vehicles outside, professionally modified, much more practical than the snowmobile he currently used. For Zack, tonight's harvest was becoming better and better. Zack never rushed into the fight. Instead, he stayed hidden above the hospital lobby and calmly waited for both sides to weaken each other first. The Black Shark gang continued firing desperately while the tyrant rampaged through the building like a monster from a nightmare. 5 minutes later, everything finally went silent. Most of the gang members were dead. The surviving few had been torn apart, trying to escape. Meanwhile, the tyrant remained standing, but its massive body was badly damaged from non-stop gunfire and explosions. That was the moment Zack moved. He jumped directly from the 3rd floor toward the ruined lobby below. While still in midair, he pulled a bundle of TNT explosives from the storage dimension. The fuse was already burning. Without hesitation, he hurled the explosives straight toward the tyrant. The mutant instinctively opened its mouth and bit down on the object, mistaking it for prey. A second later, Zack hit the floor, rolled to absorb the impact, and instantly dove behind a thick concrete support pillar. Then, the explosion detonated. The entire hospital shook violently. Dust and debris blasted through the lobby while shattered glass rained everywhere. Once the smoke finally cleared, the tyrant's enormous body collapsed motionless onto the floor. Its head was completely gone. Zack calmly approached the corpse and began searching through the destroyed remains. Soon, buried deep inside the burned flesh, he found what he wanted. A crystal core glowing with deep blue light, much larger than the earlier ones. A level 2 power core. The moment Zack touched it, the system immediately detected an enormous energy source and asked whether to absorb it for an upgrade. He accepted instantly. The crystal dissolved into pure energy that surged directly into his body. In that moment, Zack felt every muscle, nerve, and bone strengthen rapidly. His senses sharpened dramatically while his physical condition improved far beyond before. The Horde system successfully advanced to level 2, and along with the upgrade came a brand new ability, Space Blade. The skill allowed Zack to create razor-thin spatial fractures capable of cutting through physical matter regardless of durability. Curious, Zack immediately tested it. A thin black line appeared at his fingertip like a crack in reality itself. When he lightly moved his hand across one of the armored vehicles nearby, the thick steel plating split apart effortlessly as though sliced by an invisible blade. The cut was perfectly smooth. Even reinforced metal offered zero resistance. The destructive power was terrifying. Satisfied with the result, Zack dismissed the ability and turned toward the remaining armored vehicles. Moments later, both vehicles, along with every remaining supply inside them, disappeared into the storage space. This hospital trip had turned out even better than expected. Medicine, a system upgrade, new combat abilities, armored transport vehicles, everything had gone perfectly. Soon afterward, Zack climbed back onto the snowmobile and vanished once again into the frozen darkness. By the 15th day of the apocalypse, the situation across the city had completely collapsed. Inside the city sports center survivor shelter, the atmosphere had become unbearable. The air no longer circulated properly. The entire stadium smelled of sweat, waste, blood, and decay. What once held 50,000 people now sheltered barely over half that number, and even those survivors looked more like walking corpses than humans. The little order that once existed inside the camp was already gone. When the backup generators finally failed the previous night, the last traces of civilization disappeared with them. No heating, no power, almost no food remaining. Starving survivors began accusing the shelter leadership of hiding supplies for themselves, while ordinary people chewed tree bark and frozen scraps to survive. Then, the riots began. Thousands of desperate civilians suddenly broke through the weakened security lines and charged toward the shelter command area in pure desperation. Gunfire erupted instantly, people screamed, bodies crashed together, and before long the entire stadium descended into complete chaos. Stella sat curled up in a freezing corner of the stadium stands while tightly gripping a worn snow shovel whose edge had already gone dull from constant use. Only 2 weeks into the apocalypse, her entire appearance had changed completely. The soft hands she once carefully protected were now covered in frostbite wounds, cracked skin, and blood-filled blisters. Ever since arriving at the government shelter, the clear system had become both her greatest advantage and her greatest curse. Because of her ability, the officials forced her to clear blocked roads, frozen debris, and collapsed passages almost non-stop in exchange for tiny portions of food. To them, she was no longer a person, just a useful tool. Suddenly Troy rushed toward her through the chaotic crowd. His face was stained with blood, and in his hands he carried a fire axe stolen during the riots. The fear in his eyes was obvious. According to the latest news spreading through the shelter, Infected creatures had already broken through the outer defenses. The entire sports center was on the verge of collapse. Troy insisted they needed to escape immediately. But Stella looked outside toward the endless white storm with hollow eyes. At -60 degrees, leaving the shelter sounded almost suicidal. That was when Troy revealed his real idea. He said they should head west, to Damien's fortress. At first, Stella did not understand how two people could possibly take over a heavily fortified base by themselves. But Troy had already thought further ahead. He explained that if they revealed the existence of the fortress to the shelter leadership, things would change completely. Thousands of starving survivors plus armed military forces would become an unstoppable wave. No matter how strong Damien's shelter was, it could not possibly resist an entire desperate army. The moment Stella heard that, something dark shifted inside her. All the suffering, humiliation, and jealousy she had buried until now twisted together into pure resentment. Why should Damien live comfortably while she suffered like this? Why should he survive in warmth while she froze in misery? A few minutes later, Stella stormed directly into the shelter command office. Inside, Commander Wong and several officers were already preparing emergency evacuation plans while destroying important files before fleeing. When Stella burst into the room shouting about supplies and a hidden fortress, soldiers immediately aimed their weapons at her, but she ignored the guns completely. Breathlessly, she explained that Damien possessed a horde system ability and had secretly emptied huge storage facilities before the apocalypse began. According to her, he had built a fully supplied underground fortress somewhere in the Western District. Food, power, fuel, shelter, enough resources for everyone. At first, Commander Wang suspected she was lying, but Stella sounded desperate and convincing enough that his expression slowly changed. Then greed appeared in his eyes. In the current world, supplies meant power, and whoever controlled food controlled survival itself. Without hesitation, Commander Wong slammed his hand onto the Western District location marked on the map and immediately began shouting orders. He announced to the remaining survivors that there was a hidden fortress filled with supplies waiting in the west. Anyone who wanted to survive should follow him. Anyone who reached the fortress first would get food, warmth, and safety. The effect was immediate. The starving crowd that had been tearing itself apart moments earlier suddenly united around a new target. Hope mixed together with envy and desperation. Thousands of survivors instantly turned their anger toward the unknown person, supposedly hiding endless supplies for himself, while everyone else suffered. Soon afterward, a massive convoy pushed out into the blizzard. 5 armored vehicles led the way, while modified trucks and endless waves of survivors followed behind through the snow. Some carried guns, others carried axes, pipes, or improvised weapons, but all of them shared the same look in their eyes: desperation, greed, and the willingness to kill for survival. Stella sat inside the lead armored vehicle while tightly holding a compressed survival biscuit like it was treasure. Across from her, Commander Wang wore a satisfied smile after hearing the details about Damien's fortress. In Stella's mind, everything was finally about to change. This time, she was not arriving alone. She was bringing an entire army to his doorstep. Outside, the massive convoy pushed slowly through the frozen wasteland. Armored vehicles crushed through the snow while thousands of desperate survivors marched behind them carrying every weapon they could find. And even farther behind the human column, another threat followed silently: a massive zombie horde, drawn by the scent of living flesh. Countless infected creatures trailed the convoy through the blizzard like predators stalking prey. Back inside the fortress, Zack remained completely calm. He had disabled all unnecessary warning alarms days ago because the constant alerts had become annoying. Now he simply stood behind the enormous, reinforced observation window on the second floor while holding a glass of red wine in one hand. Dressed in a black tactical coat, he looked less like a survivor and more like someone calmly watching a stage performance prepared for his entertainment. Across the surveillance monitors, countless red warning markers filled the screen. The system quickly analyzed the approaching force. Thousands of armed survivors, multiple armored vehicles, heavy machine guns, rocket launchers, several awakened ability users, a huge infected horde following behind, even a few level 2 mutants hidden among the zombies. Seeing the numbers only made Zack smile slightly. Most people would panic facing a force capable of overwhelming entire military bases. But Zack felt something completely different: excitement. The last few days inside the fortress had become boring. He had spent most of the time improving abilities, organizing supplies, and passing time indoors. Now, finally, something interesting had arrived. As the convoy approached within range, Commander Wang ordered everyone to halt roughly 500 meters away from the fortress. Using loudspeakers mounted on the armored vehicles, he officially announced himself as a representative of Shelter 7's rescue forces. He demanded that the fortress owner surrender all supplies and open the gates immediately under emergency authority. In exchange, he promised safety and special treatment. Zack almost laughed hearing it. Special treatment? More like becoming their prisoner. When Zack's mocking response echoed back through the speakers, Commander Wang's face darkened instantly. He had not expected resistance. Frustrated, he immediately ordered Stella to step forward and pressure Damien personally. Holding a megaphone, Stella climbed onto the armored vehicle, despite the freezing wind nearly knocking her over. The hatred in her eyes burned hotter than the blizzard around her. She shouted that the fortress was surrounded and accused Damien of selfishly hoarding enough supplies to save thousands while innocent people starved outside. According to her, if he opened the gates willingly, people might still spare him. Otherwise, once they forced their way inside, he would be ripped apart by the crowd. Inside the fortress, Zack only shook his head slowly while resting one finger against a red control button. Even now, Stella still understood nothing. Commander Wang finally lost patience completely. He barked the order to fire. Moments later, one of the armored vehicles launched a rocket directly toward the fortress entrance. But before the projectile could strike, Zack calmly activated a new system ability, Space Refraction Field. The rocket never reached the fortress. The moment it touched the invisible refraction field, the projectile twisted unnaturally in midair and shot straight back toward the convoy. A second later, it slammed directly into one of their own transport trucks. The explosion lit up the snowfield instantly. Flames erupted into the sky while the armored truck was ripped apart into twisted metal. Burning debris, shattered weapons, and pieces of bodies scattered across the frozen ground. For a brief moment, everyone stood frozen in disbelief. Then panic erupted. Commander Wang immediately screamed for return fire. Heavy machine guns and rifles opened up together, flooding the fortress walls with bullets. But the reinforced structure barely reacted. Most rounds only produced tiny sparks against the armored exterior, leaving little more than scratches. Watching from above, Zack calmly snapped his fingers. Then he activated the next stage of the fortress defense system. The snowfield outside instantly became a nightmare. Beneath the advancing crowd, hidden explosive mines armed themselves simultaneously. A split second later, the entire battlefield erupted. Hundreds of directional anti-personnel explosives detonated one after another in a massive chain reaction. The snow exploded upward alongside blood and shattered bodies. Entire groups of survivors disappeared before they could even scream properly. The front lines instantly collapsed into chaos. Terrified people tried retreating backward, but thousands behind them were still pushing forward blindly through the storm. Screaming, trampling, gunfire, explosions, everything mixed together into madness. And then the real disaster arrived. At the rear of the convoy, deafening roars suddenly echoed through the snow. The zombie horde that had been following the survivors finally attacked. Drawn completely insane by blood and explosions, thousands of infected creatures charged directly into the back of the crowd. People began screaming about zombies breaking through behind them. Suddenly, the entire army found itself trapped. A deadly minefield and an untouchable fortress stood in front. A massive zombie horde closed in from behind. They had turned themselves into meat trapped inside a grinder. In desperation, Commander Wang grabbed Stella and pressed a gun against her head while screaming for her to clear the minefield with her ability. Trembling violently, Stella forced herself to activate the clear system repeatedly. A few mines vanished. But compared to the enormous minefield surrounding them, her power accomplished almost nothing. Within less than a minute, blood started pouring from her nose as mental exhaustion overwhelmed her completely. She collapsed helplessly onto the armored vehicle roof. Seeing she was no longer useful, Commander Wang cursed at her and kicked her off the vehicle before retreating inside to escape. But Zack had no intention of allowing anyone to flee so easily. Standing calmly on the fortress terrace, he slowly raised one hand toward the turning armored vehicle. Then he activated his newest ability, Space Blade. A thin black fracture suddenly tore through the air itself. Completely silent. The next instant, the massive armored vehicle split perfectly in half down the middle. The cut looked impossibly smooth, as though the vehicle had been sliced apart by an invisible god-sized blade. For several seconds, the entire battlefield seemed to freeze. Humans, zombies. Everyone stared in horror at the impossible destruction caused by a single attack. After that, the battle turned into complete slaughter. The fighting continued for nearly 3 hours. By the time everything finally ended, almost the entire expedition force had been wiped out. Only a small number managed to escape into the frozen wilderness during the chaos. Eventually, even the snowfall stopped. A pale moon appeared weakly above the ruined battlefield, shining down over mountains of corpses and blood-covered snow. And in front of the fortress gates, only 2 survivors still remained alive, Stella and Troy. Ironically, the reason they survived was because Commander Wang had thrown Stella off the armored vehicle earlier, allowing both of them to avoid the first massive explosion. Stella and Troy only survived because they hid beneath the wreckage of the destroyed armored vehicle and pretended to be dead while the battle raged around them. But now the battlefield had gone silent, and there was nowhere left to run. The massive fortress gate slowly opened. Zack stepped out alone. He was not wearing heavy combat armor this time, just a black shirt, military boots and the tactical axe hanging casually in one hand. Yet somehow, that made him look even more terrifying. Each step he took across the blood-stained snow felt unbearably heavy to the two people kneeling before him. Stella's face was covered in dried blood while her hands had already turned dark blue from frostbite. The moment she saw Zack approach, she immediately collapsed onto all fours and crawled toward him desperately. She claimed she had been wrong all along and blamed everything on Commander Wang. According to her, she had only acted out of fear and had been forced into the situation against her will. Beside her, Troy instantly followed. He dropped to his knees and began begging frantically for mercy. He swore he would serve Zack forever if only he was allowed to live. Zack stopped roughly 2 meters away from them. Without saying a word, he activated the horde system. A small dining table appeared in the snow, then chairs, a clay hot pot stove, fresh broth, seasoning. Within moments, rich, spicy aroma filled the freezing air once again, completely overwhelming the smell of blood and corpses around them. Zack calmly sat down and began cooking thin slices of lamb inside the bubbling broth, as though the battlefield around them did not even exist. The sight alone nearly drove Stella and Troy insane. They had not eaten properly in days. Watching steam rise from fresh meat while warmth spread through the air felt almost like torture. Neither of them could stop swallowing repeatedly while staring at the food. Zack slowly lifted a slice of meat with his chopsticks, cooled it with a gentle breath, and ate it calmly. Only after savoring the bite did he finally speak. He reminded them that in his previous life, he had once begged them exactly the same way. Back then, he only wanted a sip of water. Even expired food scraps would have been enough. But Stella had told him supplies were meant only for people who mattered, and that someone like him was not even worth wasting resources on. Hearing those words repeated back at her made Stella tremble uncontrollably. Zack's eyes became colder than the frozen world around them. Then, he calmly declared he was simply returning those same words to their original owners. After standing up slowly, the moonlight reflected off the edge of his tactical axe. Then he looked directly at Troy. Zack reminded him that he once claimed he truly loved Stella and would die for her if necessary. At first, Troy hesitated nervously. Then Zack made him an offer. Kill Stella. And in exchange, he would be allowed inside the fortress. Warmth, food, safety, even an evolution serum capable of turning him into an awakened survivor. A dagger suddenly appeared in the snow between them. Stella immediately backed away in horror while desperately insisting Troy would never do something like that. But Troy's eyes had already changed. He looked at the dagger, then at the brightly lit fortress behind Zack, then finally at Stella herself. The hesitation in his face lasted only a few seconds. In the end, survival won again. Muttering an apology under his breath, Troy suddenly grabbed the dagger and lunged directly toward Stella with a twisted, desperate expression. The moment Troy grabbed the dagger, whatever remained between him and Stella completely disappeared. In his eyes, survival mattered more than love, loyalty, or guilt. He screamed that if Stella died, he could still live. According to him, she had already lost everything anyway, so sacrificing herself for him should not matter. Then he attacked. Stella immediately let out a terrified scream and forced the last traces of strength from the clear system. Her mental energy was nearly exhausted, but she still managed to activate the ability one final time. The dagger vanished from Troy's hand instantly, but it no longer mattered. By the time the weapon disappeared, Troy had already crashed into her body and pinned her into the blood-stained snow. His hands locked tightly around her throat, while rage and desperation twisted his face into something barely human. The two of them rolled through the frozen battlefield, clawing, biting, and tearing at each other like wild animals fighting over survival. Stella scratched at his face desperately. Troy slammed her head into the frozen ground repeatedly. Blood mixed with snow beneath them while both screamed in hatred and panic. Meanwhile, Zack simply stood nearby, watching everything silently. To him, the entire scene felt pathetic. A perfect ending for two people who betrayed everyone around them the moment survival became difficult. Eventually, both Stella and Troy collapsed into the snow, completely exhausted. Stella's face had been ripped open by bites and scratches. One of Troy's eyes was ruined completely. The two barely looked human anymore. Only then did Zack slowly clap his hands once, calmly, mockingly. He admitted that Troy had performed surprisingly well. But there was one problem. The offer had been a lie from the beginning. Zack slowly walked toward them while lifting the tactical axe into the air. According to him, his fortress would never accept garbage inside. The moment those words sank in, true despair finally appeared on Stella and Troy's faces. Their screams echoed through the frozen night. Then the axe fell. At long last, the debts from Zack's previous life were finally settled. Afterward, he did not waste another second looking at the bodies. Without emotion, Zack turned around and walked back toward the fortress. Inside, warmth from the fireplace filled the room while the storm continued raging endlessly outside the reinforced windows. Zack walked toward the liquor cabinet and quietly poured 2 glasses of aged whiskey. One glass he slowly emptied onto the floor, a farewell to the weak and foolish version of himself from his previous life. The second glass he raised toward the frozen world outside, a silent toast to the brutal new era that had begun. This time, he had survived on his own terms.